All right, everybody. So here's what we're going to do. We are eagerly anticipating getting our feed in the James Colley courtroom. As soon as we have it, we're going to jump back there. I do want to ask one quick question from David Eisbrouch. Great to see you again, David. Got to ask you one quick question before we jump into James Colley. One more question about this. The bench trial, right, for the Chicago police trial. I'm always curious to get the perspective of different attorneys about this. It's a very different case, right, than trying in front of a jury, especially this kind of case. Your thoughts? Extremely.
Defense counsel for the three cops moved for a bench trial, which they're entitled to in Chicago. It was granted. It is the dynamics of this trial will be very different from the underlying trial, from the Van Dyke trial. It is solely in the judge's hands. History in Cook County, Chicago, will tell you that bench trials for police officers normally go acquittals. Basically, you have a judge who's a state employee, you have prosecutors, you have defense attorneys. You do not have a jury. You have purposely a judge, a cop, defense attorneys, and prosecutors. Now, I'm not saying it was prearranged. I'm just saying it is a totally different dynamic. And in Chicago, predominantly acquittals for bench trials when they're prosecuting police officers.
I'm not going to discount anything with sitting on a jury and how hard that is and trying to understand the law, but you can't forget, you can't ignore the fact that a judge is trained in the law. Jurors are sometimes listening to these laws for the very first time. They have no concept of what it is until the jury instructions come out. Is there a difference in the way that a defense attorney or even a prosecutor presents this? Do they have to be so animated and so much about the facts so they say, listen, we know what's happening here, Judge. Let's just argue the law here.
Precisely. You're not going to see the animated or the theatrics that you will in front of a jury. You're not going to have some of the objections. You're not going to have just some of the acting, we'll call it, that you will for the jury's sake. A judge is there to interpret the law, to instruct on the law, and the jury is there to hear the facts and apply those facts to the law. Now you have the judge doing both. The judge is essentially an expert on both.
Well, you'd hope so, at least. Okay, David, stand by. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we might be live in the James Colley sentencing hearing. We'll be right back. Okay, we're going to talk more about that case in a minute, but we have a breaking development in the James Colley case. It has just been reported that James Colley has been sentenced to death by the judge in this case. Really quick, not much to see there. It was very, very sudden, but this is what we expected. We believe the judge was going to approve the jury's recommendation. Let's get some reaction, though, right now to this. I want to start back at Jacksonville State University with forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, we've been covering it for a while now. We covered the trial. This is the conclusion of it. We talked about it all this morning. Your reaction to seeing this in light of reviewing the details of this crime?
Just the unabashed brutality involved in this case, Jesse. I have to tell you, I'm not surprised. The jury was certainly compelled. It didn't take them very, very long to come back with their verdict and their recommendation, obviously. And, you know, it just required the judge to affirm this. This is a brutal, brutal set of circumstances and killing that took place. You know, these people were just sitting ducks. And what's really compelling about this, Jesse, is that this wasn't a sudden event. This is something that, as you had mentioned earlier, he came into this home and literally trashed it the night before. There was a warning that he was angry, that he was going to rip people to shreds, and boy, did he ever.
You know, David, back here with David Eisbrouch. David, one of the things that we had talked about, a little surprising, not that much from the judge. I was expecting a long statement, some sort of speech about what this whole crime means to the community and the world at large, but really just a sentence of death.
Jesse, I think as Joseph said it, the crime and the gravity of the crime almost spoke for itself. The judge really had no other alternative other than to affirm the recommendation of the jury, impose the death sentence. As I said before, the appellate process will probably take somewhere between 15 to 30 years. He's not going to be killed anytime soon. quite frankly, I'm also surprised that an insanity defense was not used there. It may have had some effect on the sentencing, but they went with an earlier, I think, ambient defense, and then they dropped that. But, you know, depraved indifference of the wife being with a boyfriend, a new boyfriend, even though they weren't together anymore, even though he didn't find him in bed together, you know, you almost want to grasp for something that's going to save this guy's life, and they didn't do it.
Even the fact that they had kids, that didn't save his life. And we've seen that before, too. Parents who commit these atrocious crimes, even the fact that they are a parent to a child, that's never, that doesn't mean that they'll necessarily be, their life will be spared. All right, we're going to switch gears right now, and we're going to go back to talking about the police cover-up trial out of Chicago, Illinois. We covered it this past week. In case you missed the prosecution's opening statement, let's start right there. They got together. That's what I want to talk about right now. David, trying to prove conspiracy, is that tough? Yeah, you can say that maybe the reports contain inaccurate information, maybe it was sloppy police work, maybe they didn't do the right things based upon protocol, but conspiracy is a different kind of thing, right? I mean, that must be tough.
It is tough. You have to prove the intent for the three of them to conspire to cover up this crime. And remember, the initial statements given by these policemen were before the video became available. So it would be interesting to see how their stories morph as the video came out, because I believe, and I'd have to look at it a little more closely, is that, you know, their initial statements in their reports did not follow really what the video showed. So the intent's going to have to be proven. As I said before, a bench trial usually favors the defense. The judge may try to compromise here, may try to find them guilty of a lesser crime as well. There's going to be some outrage if these cops walk.
There's a lot of options to consider here, and we have a lot to talk about. I'm glad you're with us. Joseph, I want to come back to you, though. You've reviewed a lot of different police reports, right? And so when you see this case, does anything stand out to you?
Going back very briefly to this idea of conspiracy, that's a very significant threshold that you have to get. You know, in the moment, we had talked about this yesterday, I believe. They have to enter into an agreement, and this is a rather complex agreement to conspire to do this, and you have to be able to prove this, and so that's very difficult. This is a very frenetic environment that they're in. It requires some planning in order to get everybody's quote-unquote story correct. And so it's multi-layered. I think, you know, one of the keys that we talked about yesterday was that seminal moment when the detective spoke to the ME investigator. You know, and this guy's not, if there is a conspiracy, he's not on board with it. He's just receiving this information, and, you know, it's left him kind of scratching his head at the end of the day. So, yeah, it's highly complex.
Okay, David, was there something improper about automatically not classifying this as a homicide? They didn't classify it as a homicide in the reports. They said this was an aggravated assault that resulted in the death of the person who was committing this aggravated assault. They basically said that Laquan McDonald was the offender. When you hear that, in light of everything that we know with this case, your thoughts?
Absolutely. This was a homicide. This was a cold-blooded killing. You see the video. You saw the distance where Van Dyke was from the victim, and, you know, the way they try to categorize it, the way they try to bend and mold the self-defense here was absolutely, I would call it a conspiracy. Now, again, what Joseph said is, can they prove the three of them got together and conspired to do this in unison, or was it just sloppy reporting? That's what the judge is going to have to decide.
Can you show that without saying, oh, they went into a dark room and huddled together? Can you show that if there's similarities in the reports, if there's things like that, like a pattern?
No, absolutely. You'll show the timeline. You'll see what they said and when they said it. You'll look at the wording itself, absolutely. You'll look at their past history. They looked at the history of Van Dyke as well. He had many complaints against him, some involving physical assaults and other altercations. They'll look at the reputations of these three cops themselves. If they're favorable, defense is going to try to bring them out. If they're not favorable, the prosecutor is going to try to bring them out.
What I'll say is, just we're showing B-roll of these defendants. In my perspective, they have the look of the face of, I can't believe we're here. I think they're shocked looking that they're on trial and the charges that they face. And really, they are facing some very, very serious charges, and they are having to answer very serious questions. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a break, though. And when we come back, we're going to revisit everything that happened this past week. So stay tuned here on Law&Crime. I think I could watch that all day. Let's get some reaction right now. Attorney David Eisbrouch is with us. David, remember, he's not arguing in front of a jury. He's arguing in front of one judge. Split opinion on him? I've seen. What do you think?
Jesse, as I said before, you wouldn't expect the attorneys to be using theatrics in front of a judge. And he wasn't, but he was walking a very fine line. He wasn't using theatrics, but he was being emotional. He was being forceful. He was pointing out all the positive things that his defendant did during this investigation. The most important one, which he said at the end, is that he was responsible for taking the video, which has now been the evidence A of the prosecution against Van Dyke and is going to be used against these cops. He was responsible for actually securing that video. He didn't try to do anything with it. He didn't try to hide it. I mean, that would have been very bad if he did. But he tried to point out all the positive and all the correct things his defendant did to the judge. And that's exactly what his job was. I think he was very effective.
And Joseph, I'm back here with Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. We talked about police reports. He's talking about how it incorporates information just from what people said. How can you blame him? What do you think about that?
Yeah, this guy's very impassioned about this, and he's just detailing that March was doing his job. He was doing his job under very difficult circumstances. He talked about collecting of the spent casings. He talked about security of the scene, and of course the video. You know, it's not his, as he pointed out. It's not his to release to the public. That's at a much higher pay grade in a circumstance like this, particularly in a multi-layered environment like Chicago PD is.
And, okay, you both make great points about this, and really that was just the beginning. That was one defense attorney, one defense opening statement. Let's move on now to the opening statement for Officer Joseph Walsh. Let's not forget, Joseph Walsh was the partner of Jason Van Dyke on the night of the shooting. Let's go. Different style, different arguments. David, what'd you think?
Interesting. His client, Joseph Walsh, is the partner of Van Dyke, who was the shooter that night. He's trying to make the argument that his client had no responsibility the next day other than get up and go to work. Well, he had to file a report. He was an eyewitness. He was critical to this investigation. I don't know if I really agree with his strategy there, what he went after.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's different. Every one of them argues a little bit differently for their respective clients. Joseph, one of the things that he mentioned is people perceive things differently. And in your experience, trying to analyze a crime scene, what happened, witness testimony, is it accurate to say that people could perceive things radically differently?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know, you have different visual perspectives, auditory perspectives, and also reactive perspectives. You know, like how are you going to react given a certain set of circumstances, given particular stimuli in that environment? You know, what's your level of adrenaline that's pumping through your veins at this point in time? And perception in this particular case is you know, whatever their reality is at that particular time. We can't. That's not something, you know, I'm a scientist by trade, so it's not something that's necessarily measurable because everybody's going to react different. I think that in this particular attorney's case, he's trying to paint this guy as just an everyday working Joe. You know, he's going to leave work, get up the next morning, come back in, and that's what he's trying to portray here in this opening statement. While it's not as passionate as the first guy, I think that it kind of gives us an insight into the tack that he's going to take.
All right, let's see the reaction now to the third defense opening. This is of Thomas Gaffney, the defense attorney for Thomas Gaffney. Let's go. The fact that you disagree with the report doesn't mean it was a false report. David, what do you think? Great
point to close on. I'm not sure if that was his closing or near the end, but great point. I think he did a very good job of delineating between you may disagree with the report, doesn't mean it's a fake report. He also did a very good job earlier on to emphasize that this was a dangerous person that they encountered earlier before you actually see the shooting. When this officer encountered the child, the deceased now, earlier, and that he had a knife in his hand raised over his head, that he was a dangerous person at that time, and that basically when his client, the police officer, showed up later and he wrote his report, it was accurate. The tactical report that he filed was accurate. The judge will review that. I think it's interesting that all three defense attorneys put the pieces of the puzzle together for the judge from different perspectives, and I don't think it was by coincidence.
You think that they had some conversation?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, we'll talk more about that. Joseph, my question to you is, you've seen a lot of different kinds of attacks in your life. You've seen a lot of different crime scenes. In your opinion, was this an aggravated assault?
Was it an ag assault? Well, that's an interesting question, I have to say. When they're blending terms here, relative to, first off, these technical reports that they're talking about, and then of course everybody wants to go over to the side of this impassioned idea of murder, and then we have this kind of common ground, this meeting place. Was this an ag assault at that particular time? I don't know. I don't know how this will be specifically defined under the law. But at the end of the day, you've got these three police officers, as David pointed out, coming from their different perspectives, putting together this report. Look, let me explain something to you. Yeah, out on crime scenes, we do talk. It's part of communication. It's part of us getting the message across. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, can you actually say that these guys conspired in their communications with one another, and is this borne out in these reports? And this is, again, a huge threshold they're going to have to cover. The more and more I hear about this, the less confidence I have that they're actually going to prove conspiracy here.
Well, we have to go back to the shooting, don't we? And when we come back from our short break, that's what we're going to do. We're going to listen to the testimony of people that were right there. We'll be right back. All right, so that was Thomas Gaffney's partner. Now, David, one of the things is, he was on the scene. He didn't fire his weapon. We know that Jason Van Dyke did. My question is, if Van Dyke was by himself and there were no other officers around, you couldn't compare his actions to another officer, right? So that's what makes this really critical, I would believe, in the Van Dyke trial.
Again, you have to go back with the initial premise that if it weren't for this video, none of this is happening. Probably is not. There is an investigation. Probably charges are not pressed against Van Dyke. No trial. These cops aren't on trial for conspiracy. This guy, and I'd like to hear what Joseph has to say on this also, you have the blue wall, obviously, in the background, where all the cops try to protect each other. He's trying to do as good job as he can to protect Van Dyke, but at the same time, he's asked the critical question by the prosecutor, why didn't you draw your weapon, why didn't you shoot? And he had to say that we did not feel that he was creating a threat to us at that time. He was not walking toward us. In the video where Van Dyke shot, he wasn't walking toward Van Dyke either. So he's walking a fine line here. He's trying to protect his brethren, but at the same time, he could be doing some damage.
Well, the argument is that he's trying to protect. We don't know, right? We can assume that is, but we also can assume he's just trying to restate the facts. And yes, I think we can all agree it's difficult for him to testify in this case. Joseph, your reaction to seeing him testify in the Van Dyke trial?
Yeah, we talked about the video, that if it wasn't for the video, we wouldn't be having a trial. If they had had tasers, he'd still be with us, probably. The young man that's deceased.
Right.
And this has been an ongoing problem. They had the same problem in New York City. They have it. They have it in Chicago. I don't understand. It baffles me that these guys don't have access to something that is part of the continuum of force, that is non-lethal, to take this guy down and end it right there. But no, with this escalation, you go from verbal commands to a weapon that is drawn, a firearm that ends this kid's life, and it's a real head scratcher from a procedural standpoint. And
that's why ultimately Jason Van Dyke was convicted, because they had a protocol and he violated it. Let's play now Officer Joseph McGilligot when he testified this past week, remember the partner of Thomas Gaffney, in this trial. Let's see how it compared. Okay, so that was him testifying in this trial. Now, David, my question to you is, didn't we resolve this issue back in the Van Dyke case? Didn't we resolve that this was an unjustifiable shooting? Unless you think it's pivotal that we still have this testimony in the cover-up trial. If so, why?
Well, again, this is a separate trial to lay out the allegations against the three cops for conspiracy or cover-up. If you're charging them with a conspiracy, you have to delve into, again, the underlying crime of what they are being accused of covering up. And then you have to walk through what he did the night of the event, whether he thought there was a threat to Van Dyke. He already testified twice that he didn't feel there was a threat to himself. He was asked a very good question. If you thought there was a threat to your partner, would you have shot him? And he said yes. And they're obviously trying to build up the sequence there. Then I think another important part of his testimony is when you went back to the police station, what was done there. They have to lay out the procedures and whether it was followed properly of filling out the report. He said they looked at a video. He wasn't too clear. He said they looked at the McDonald's video. I'm not sure if he said whether they looked at the video of the shooting, but the immediate follow-up and the procedures that are followed after the shooting back at the police station, especially some cases I've held represented in civil rights cases, is crucial to the case. If the police followed proper protocol, what they did, who they spoke to in the police department, in the police station afterwards, who was in charge, and who spoke to whom, and what did they say to each other.
You know, Joseph, you have been a part of these kinds of investigations. I mean, you're part of the medical examiner's office was integrally involved in how this investigation goes underway. Did you see any issues in how the tapes were reviewed and how evidence was collected and how witnesses were interviewed? Did you see any problems here?
Yeah, this is my biggest problem with any case like this. Anything that is related to the police, whether it's an in-custody death, you know, they're in prison, they're in the back of a squad car, or it's a shooting. It should be locked down. The case should be locked down, and this should immediately be turned over to a third party, like the Illinois State Police should come in and investigate this thing. This should not be left in the hands of the Chicago PD, period. End of story. It's that simple. But it gets convoluted along the way. Because this is, at the end of the day, this is why people distrust investigations that are conducted by the police against other police. Particularly when it is a local issue. Now this thing's blossomed out to now it's impacting people nationally. And we've seen this over and over and over again. You have to give that there is no hint of impropriety whatsoever. Now going back and you're hearing this thing about reviewing videos and you're talking about reports and all this stuff, even if there is nothing that has gone wrong here, it still opens the door up that there might be a little thread that runs through it where they're conspiring to do something. And at the end of the day, people like myself that work at medical examiners and coroners and places like that, we should be, you know, the police should advocate for an objective outside view to come in, because you want the purest story that you possibly can have.
You make a great point there, Joseph. Listen, Officer Joseph McGilligot was a very strong witness, but let's see how he did under cross-examination when we come back. 3 different lines of questioning. Let's try to see what we learned back here with David Eisbrouch. You saw 3 different attorneys cross-examine him. What were they all trying to get at there?
Interesting. Gaffney's attorney took him through the justification. He wanted to justify the shooting. He wanted to cut right to the chase, saying whatever is in their reports is correct because this shooting was justified. Walsh's attorney went right to the interview process of after they went back to the police station, what was done there. And Marsh's attorney tried to elicit the testimony that if there were any witnesses, they left on their own. So there must be some underlying charges here that perhaps that they didn't do whatever they could to get witness statements. But he brought out the fact that if the witnesses were there, they left on their own. This was not due to any coercing or any recommendation by any of these 3 cops. Going back to what we said earlier, each three of the attorneys went after a different area, which again, and call me a conspiracy theorist, that they spoke before, they all decided what they were going to go after, they didn't want to repeat themselves, and they each elicited testimony from the officer that would help all three of them.
I want to follow up with you on that. That is okay to do. Let's just break that down. They're represented by separate counsel, right? But even if that's the case, three attorneys can come together and come with a common defense strategy and talk? I mean, explain that to our viewers.
Well, there's a defense. It's not a defense team like the O.J. Simpson where they're all representing one defendant, but there is a defense team of sort representing three different officers in the same department on the same crime, all charged with the same charges. So there has been communication between these three. Matter of fact, they had to decide certain things amongst themselves. For instance, when we saw the opening statement, they could have had one opening statement for the three of them. They each opened on their own, but they're all representing each officer individually, but with common charges. So there has to be communication between the three.
Okay.
Unless Joseph disagrees.
Well, Joseph, my question to you is, let's put aside conspiracy, okay? Do you see something along the lines of, hey, this was a shooting, this is the officers, even Officer Joseph McGilliot, there was a shooting, I don't want to press and ask more questions than we need. We saw someone got shot, he was holding a knife, that's it. Was it an idea not so much to cover it up, but hey, we're just going to take the blue word for it. You know what I'm saying? It's not so much let's try to cover up what happened, let's try to delete stuff, let's try to get rid of video records, nothing like that. Let's not try to falsify reports. Just, you know what, we're not going to look into this more than we need to.
Oh, so we're talking about sins of omission as opposed to commission, right?
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, I guess that could potentially be argued. What I take away from this particular witness is they're painting kind of a slice of life relative to what his purpose was there. Keep in mind, they talk about what he was faced with. You got a guy banging on his hood. You got a guy who has taken a knife and slit his tire at this point. He actually says that you could audibly hear this thing hissing. And then he's moving away from him. He has his weapon out, but he doesn't feel the need to shoot this guy. All right, and he's really had contact with him. You know, he's within 10 feet of this guy, all this sort of thing. So they're painting, this narrative has been painted in kind of a compelling way, but then they bring it back around and talk about what his duties are there. His duties are not to go out and question people and this sort of thing in this context. He's simply doing his job. And he's not an investigator. This is going to be turned over to somebody else. He's a beat cop. That's what he does. Right. He does it day in and day out.
All right. Well, I got great perspectives from both my guests, and they're going to join me for one more segment because when we get back, we're going to talk about such a key witness, Dora Fontaine. We'll be right back. All right, David, this is a big witness here, okay? So first, the idea of whether or not Laquan McDonald was the aggressor here, she backpedaled and said, I never said that. Don't attribute false statements to me. And we're going to play her testimony in a minute in this trial. This struck us all very surprising. She was called a rat. She was branded a rat for coming forward and saying, well, I never said that Laquan McDonald threatened to attack officers because she backpedaled. What's going on here?
Well, it's interesting. Again, you look at this, blue wall of police trying to protect police, but here you have someone who was possibly manipulated or coerced into a statement that she doesn't feel is accurate. So now her back's against the wall. She has to correct her own record, her own statement, and by the defense attorney trying to protect his client, he's forced to attack her. And without getting into any nuances of who's trying to protect who here, they're trying to punch holes in who might have coerced her into fabricating a statement.
Joseph, what do you think? She was just trying to protect her job?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I guess we're all trying to protect our job in one way or another, but, it comes down to you're out every single day as police officers, patrol person, and you're trying to do the best job you can. And everybody around you impugns you anyway in the general public, and then you're going to go to court, and they're going to try to impugn your character. Yeah, I'd get rather prickly as well.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly if you're just trying to do the right thing. And it probably sticks in her craw, I would imagine.
Well, let's see how she testified in this trial this past week. Okay, so she's basically accusing David March of lying.
If there was any doubt of her vacillating on her testimony, she cleared it up right there. She said she never saw him raise his arm. She never saw a threat. She never saw him justified in killing.
Joseph, when you're looking at this past week, what do you think of it?
Well, I think that the one word that kind of sums it up is perspective, isn't it? That's kind of what we've been kicking around all this time. And another interesting piece here, we'll go back to the fellow just prior to this, in their testimony. It turns out that there's not really a lot of civilians testifying in this, is there? We've got a whole collection of police officers that are testifying, and they all have a different perspective on this. And their lives are at stake here, as is this woman on the stand right now, her reputation, her life, and it is about her perspective. She states clearly she never saw this kid raise his arm toward him. And again, we go back to that video over and over again. It just continues to replay in my mind where he is just tracking in a different direction. And how are you going to marry that up with all of these stories?
That's a great question, the million-dollar question. Now, David, we're entering into the second week on Tuesday. What do you expect to happen?
Not sure who the witness list is, but they're going to continue to justify the procedures that were used that night. They're going to try to connect the dots as close as possible to a justified shooting. And
the defense?
Yes, on the defense to a justified shooting, so the reports are justified as well.
Okay, well, it's going to be an exciting week, I can tell you that much. And I want to thank our guests for joining us and staying with me for such a long time. First, Joseph Scott Morgan, thank you so much, my friend, and have a great weekend.
Great weekend to you too, buddy.
All right, and of course, David Eisbrouch. Great having you back here.
Jesse, always great being here. Just a plug for you and your partner, Guys Who Law podcast, going great. Listen to it every week. Fascinating current subjects.
You like my co-host?
Keep going with your co-host is a very intelligent, good-looking young man. Excellent. Guys Who Law.
I'll tell him you said that.
Guys Who Law.
Thank you so much. All right, we're going to be signing. I'm going to be signing off. Stacey Delicat is signing in. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime.